Namaste, friends, and welcome back to part two of Loving When It Feels Hard. I would highly encourage you to go back and listen, or yes, listen. I write newsletters and record podcasts, so sometimes I get myself confused. But I would go back and listen to part one if you haven't already listened to that. There's a lot of great information in part one. And the one thing that I want to make sure I say at the top of this episode, which I also said in episode one, is that learning to love beyond someone's behaviors and words that can be hurtful or challenging is absolutely not about abandoning yourself. And that has to be forefront in your mind as we go through this episode. When we pretend like something is okay, even though it's not, or pretend like we're not angry or hurt or frustrated when we actually are, that's not spirituality. That is just a common term you may have heard is spiritual bypassing. We're pretending that we're so elevated that something doesn't bother us when it actually does. And that is harmful to us. If we go back to this concept that we talked about of ahimsa in part one, that is not practicing ahimsa. That is harming yourself. And so non-harming has to come first. And non-harming looks like feeling the emotions that are present, not excusing behavior that is wrong and hurtful, and taking yourself out of any situations that are actually dangerous for you, emotionally dangerous, physically dangerous, mentally dangerous, really dangerous in any form. So I want to make sure that I'm very clear about that at the top of this episode, because last week's episode was about dealing with challenging people in our lives who they're challenging, but they may not be harmful, right? This week, we're going to go into challenging relationships where the challenge becomes actually hurtful to you in some way. And so we're going to go deeper into how do we love? How do we continue to act from a place of love? How do we continue to recognize and be aware that although we appear separate on the outside, we are all just part of the same essence, the same consciousness, the same source. And because of that, because we all come from that same source, we are all actually one, even though there's a lot in this physical reality that may try to convince us otherwise. But when we want to heal ourselves and when we want to heal the world, it's very important that we not only understand the concept that we are all one and we come from the same essence, but that it becomes not just knowledge, but embodied wisdom and a way of living in this world. And that doesn't negate the first part. That doesn't negate the fact that we also have to stand in our truth and we cannot allow people to harm us. But it allows us to do what we need to do from a different place. And we're going to go into that in more depth in this episode. So I hope that you will stick around. And if you are struggling with any relationships in your life, whether it be a close personal relationship or just someone that you know who you can't exit their orbit for whatever reason, you have to stay in contact with them, and you're struggling to do that with peace, then I hope that this episode and last week's episode are really helpful to you. And before we go on, I just want to invite you to sign up for my newsletter. The link, as always, will be in the show notes. In that newsletter, I do similar things to what I do in this podcast. The topics are often different, but it's always about, honestly, it's always about this concept in yoga called svadhyaya. And I actually didn't mention that in the previous episode, that word, but what it means, that it's a Sanskrit word, and what it means is self-study. It's the ability to study ourselves, our thoughts, our behaviors, our actions, the stories and beliefs that we hold, the wounds that we carry, and to be able to get free through that studying, through that observation of ourselves. We get to see where we are still chained, where we are allowing ourselves to be hurt by ourselves or by other people, where we are forgetting who we really are, the essence of who we really are. And it's how we walk towards freedom. Self study, this combination of ancient wisdom and self study, is how we walk towards freedom and peace in our lives. It's how we begin to see that we may be living in a cage of our own making. And we have the power, even though all these years maybe we didn't think we did, we actually have the power to step out of the cage. It's not locked. It's open, and it's always been open. We just had to choose to step out. And so I hope that's what you are getting from a lot of these podcast episodes, particularly my solo episodes. And it's what I do in my newsletter that comes out once a week. And it's an invitation to look inward, to get curious, to reflect, and to step just a little bit closer towards that peace and towards that freedom in your life. Okay, so now on to this week's episode. Okay, so let's begin with the concept of boundaries. I'm sure you are all familiar with boundaries. And when we're dealing with challenging people and relationships, and particularly when those people are close to us or very intimately involved in our lives, sometimes boundaries are necessary. And in the previous episode, I mentioned how, as working as a nurse, that I had often had difficult patients or patients who displayed difficult behaviors. And that many times, more times than not, when I continued to act and respond lovingly, even when they were difficult, it kind of melted those behaviors away and allowed the person to return to a much more closely to who they truly are, which is who we all are, right? The seat of our higher self, which is we are consciousness and we are love and we are peace. And anything that we say or do that is not who we truly are. So we talked about responding to other people from that place, from that seat of the self, from the soul, from that centeredness. And that sometimes when we are engaging with someone who is acting in challenging ways, if we can respond from the seat of ourself and from a place of love, even in the face of their difficult behaviors, we can help those behaviors kind of fall by the wayside. And that's wonderful when that works. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work. I wish that it did. So sometimes we have to go beyond just being kind and loving. And we need to take action, appropriate action. And sometimes on the outside, that action doesn't look very loving. And I think that's what I want to clarify here, is that acting from love doesn't mean that the action you need to take always looks loving. So, for example, let's go back to my nursing days as an example. I mentioned how I had these patients who, regardless of how hard I tried to be kind and present and trustworthy and transparent, their behaviors just those difficult behaviors were not melting away, and they would often escalate in some patients to getting physically and verbally violent. Some patients would curse, they would throw things. Some patients would try to take a swing at staff members. They would verbally threaten staff members. And this would actually happen between patients and our staff, our nurses and doctors, but it actually also happened between family members. And obviously, these are unacceptable behaviors. They are dangerous, and no one should have to be subject to verbal or physical assault. And no amount of me being nice was helping this de-escalate the situation. So I would often in these scenarios have to take actions that didn't look very loving from the outside. I would have to get security involved in cases where patients were very out of control, physically out of control. Oftentimes, we had patients come in who were using substances and it was making them very physically violent. And we would have to chemically or physically restrain the patient. When family members became violent between themselves, we would have to remove family members from the room and basically take them off the patient's visitor list. They were no longer able to visit them. So these are a pretty extreme example of what I'm talking about. But you have people who are exhibiting behaviors that are harmful in some way to someone else or even themselves, quite frankly. And the most loving thing that you can do is set a firm and clear boundary. And on the outside, that often doesn't look loving. It doesn't appear to be gentle. It doesn't appear to be compassionate, but it really is all about where you take that action from. It's not the action itself, it is where the action stems from. So if you have to set a boundary in your life with someone, are you setting it from anger and hostility and resentment? Are you setting it from a place of, I'm going to get back at you, of being vindictive? Or are you choosing to take that pause that we talked about in episode 1, go back to your center, and then respond from that place, knowing that a boundary is necessary, but still managing to see the other person's humanity, still being able to see that they're acting from their wounds and not from their true self, still being able to keep your heart open while you keep yourself safe. And this is the concept in yoga of viveka. Viveka means discernment or clear seeing. So, in that moment when you have to make a decision about what action you're going to take, it's the ability to see what the moment actually requires. Instead of confusing love with passivity or niceness or avoidance, it is understanding when you need to create distance, when you need to tell the truth, when you need to be firm, when you need to be gentle, right? These are all moments of discernment that happen by returning to the self so that you can be centered enough. It requires you to go internally so that you can take whatever action you need to take from love and compassion, and love and compassion for yourself and for the other person. So we might have to do things that don't appear loving on the outside, yet in our hearts, we know that they're right. And it is the internal state from which we take the action that makes the action one of love or one of separation. So I want you to just keep that in mind as you're moving through your life or you're thinking about a relationship in your life that's been really challenging. Taking appropriate action is your truth, and it's very important to stay in your truth. And it is not the action itself, it is where the action stems from. And if you take action from a place of centered, grounded, and a place where you feel unknowing, then your action will never be wrong. Whatever action you take will be the appropriate action. Love also doesn't mean that we're going to change someone else. And this is a really hard concept for everyone because oftentimes we want the other person to change, especially if it's a close relationship and the relationship is very strained and you feel that the person has been hurtful to you. Of course, you want them to change. You want the relationship to improve. You want to not be hurt anymore. You don't want to have to go through all of the challenging emotions that occur as a result of this person. And it's very understandable that you would desire change in the other person. But evolution is a personal choice. And each person has to deeply want it for themselves because we can't make somebody else change. And it does require a good deal of work, of re being able to look inside and being able to move through our own stories and beliefs and wounds. And you just can't do that for anyone else. And you also, and I've been guilty of this myself, this desire to try to show someone why their behaviors are wrong or why they're harmful and what they could do to change them or make them better. And there's an old spiritual saying that says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So if the student is not ready, if this person in your life is not ready, if they're not open and willing and receptive, they everything you say will fall on deaf ears. They will not hear it. And it may even strain the relationship further. So we have to accept, we have to be willing to accept when someone is just not ready to change, when they're not willing to change. And we have to lean into this concept of Vairagya in yoga philosophy, which translates to non-attachment. And it means that we can love for someone, we can hope for their healing, we can model another way of being, right? That's a really important idea that maybe you're not going to change, but I'm going to maintain what I know is right. So I'm modeling a certain way of being. And we can do all of that without attaching our peace to whether or not this person chooses to change. Because the second we attach our peace to anything outside of ourselves, we are in a losing battle. That is really just a recipe for remaining on a roller coaster of emotions. Peace comes from within. Peace never comes from the outside in. If you try to find your peace on the outside, there will always be something that is disrupting it. And in this case, if you're attaching your peace to someone else changing, you are going to be very disappointed and also be living in a state of uncertainty and feeling like you're always at the mercy of what someone else does. So, really trying to understand this idea that love doesn't mean that you change someone. And when someone is ready to evolve, they will. And maybe they never will. That's the other thing we have to accept. There may be people in your life that they just choose to never evolve. And depending on the relationship and what kind of relationship it is and how challenging it is, that's where you have to decide, do I remain in relationship to this person? Do I set certain boundaries to protect myself? Or do I release this relationship? Right? Then we come back to that idea of viveka or discernment, right? Because I know I can't change this person, and this person doesn't appear to have any interest in changing at the current moment. So I need to come back into my center and discern for myself from a place of love and peace and groundedness what I need to do. The next idea or concept that I want to talk about is forgiveness. And forgiveness is a very big idea. And I actually probably should do a whole separate episode on forgiveness. So we're not going to dive 100% into forgiveness today. Forgiveness can be very hard and it can take a long time to get to. And I never want anyone to rush themselves to forgiveness. As if we do that, we're in that spiritual bypassing again. We're pretending that emotions aren't there that are there. And that is not true forgiveness. That is some sort of facade of forgiveness that will be easily disrupted once something else happens, right? And it ignites the anger again. And anger, there is nothing wrong with having anger. There's nothing wrong with having any emotion. All emotions are important because they point us in the direction of our truth. When something angers us, it usually means that in some way we are being harmed or we are perceiving that we are being harmed. And anger is a protective mechanism. It's actually not a primary emotion. It is a secondary emotion, and it is one that feels protective in the moment, but it's actually hiding what's underneath of it. And underneath of it is often emotions like grief, shame, sadness, hurt. And so if you have someone in your life that you've had a challenging relationship with and you have a lot of anger towards them, I would invite you to, I personally love journaling is my favorite way to do it, but in any way that feels good to you, reflect on what's underneath of the anger. Because forgiveness can't occur until you get really truthful with yourself about what you're really feeling and how, how what this person has said or done has impacted you, and allow yourself to process those emotions. So I'll give you a quote that has really helped me in my life when it comes to anger and resentment. And this is a quote from Oprah Winfrey. She used to say this all the time on her show. And actually, I listen to her podcast now, and she still says it. And it is, in my opinion, a wonderful way to think about the concept of forgiveness, which is forgiveness is giving up the hope that the past could have been any different. It's not excusing. It's not saying it's okay. It's not letting the other person off the hook. It is surrendering. It's really the concept of surrendering this hope that the past could have been any different than it was, because we know that it couldn't have. It's the past is the past. We can't change it. And so when we're holding on to that anger that's preventing us to forgive, it's because we're trying to make sure somehow that there's this cosmic rightness that we could somehow change the past, or somehow we're letting this other person off the hook and saying, it's okay, it wasn't that bad, when we know that it was. And Oprah also says that forgiveness is about accepting the past for what it was and using this moment and this time to help yourself move forward. Right? So we release this hope that the past could have been different. And then we take what we've learned from those situations and we use it. We use the pain of those situations to help us move forward in our lives. And this has been the most useful way of moving past anger for me and moving towards forgiveness. Still, allowing yourself to understand all the emotions that are underneath of it and processing them. But it helps us get to the place of love again, choosing love. And this time we're choosing love for ourselves because as I mentioned in the previous episode, that quote that goes around that says holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. When we choose forgiveness, when we choose to give up the hope that the past could have been any different, then we are choosing love, love for ourselves. And that comes back to ahimsa, not harming, right? Holding on to that anger and resentment is harming ourselves. Forgiveness is choosing non harming, it's choosing love and using the pain of what we went through to help us to learn from it and to move forward. That is also choosing love, love for ourselves and love for the world, because you can now bring that learning, embody that learning into every other relationship that you have in your life. And there are going to be times, and I know this all too well, having certain relationships in my life, where getting to love for the other feels impossible. It just feels like too big of a leap. There's been too much hurt and too much pain. And it it just feels like, although maybe on a cerebral level you understand that we all come from the same source, that we are all one, that the person has acted from their wounds and their beliefs, and that's not the truth of who they are. We can all kind of know this conceptually, but there may be certain relationships where it feels very difficult to take that conceptual knowledge and embody it and actually live it out to that place where we can actually feel love towards another person. And I don't have all the answers for that. I feel like I'm still on that path. And I always look to great spiritual teachers for guidance. I look to Jesus and to the Buddha and to Gandhi for guidance and direction on how to get to love in those really, really, really hard relationships. And the best that I have come up with so far is we have to reach for the highest branch of loving kindness that we can muster. And that may vary relationship to relationship or even within a relationship, depending on what's going on. And for some people and some relationships, maybe your highest branch is just choosing not to speak poorly about them, right? Just choosing to avoid the trap that a lot of us fall into, is that when someone makes us really angry or hurts us, that we want to go talk about them and talk about all the bad things that they did. Maybe it's just choosing not to do that. Maybe it's reminding yourself in a moment that this is their wound speaking. This is coming from a place that is unhealed within them, their unmet needs, their fears, their pain, and just reminding yourself of that. Maybe it is softening the story that you tell yourself about them, going back to that concept that we talked about in part one, where seeing the good, trying to also see the good, not pretending the bad doesn't exist, but also being able to see the good so you can soften the story that you tell yourself about them. And maybe it is simply choosing to not let their behavior close your heart, because we talked about the wall around the heart in part one, and how when we create this wall around our heart, it can, yes, soften the experience of the pain we may experience in a challenging relationship by not letting it in, but it's also not letting love in, and not love from every other person in your life and love from yourself. And it's not letting love out. So maybe the highest branch of loving kindness you can reach is to choose to feel all the emotions you can feel, all the things that are under the anger, yes, but then all the things that are under the anger, and allowing yourself to process them and release them from your body so that you can keep your heart open. And equanimity, I think, is a very useful concept here. In yoga, this is called upeksha. And it's the ability to stay steady, grounded, and clear, even in the presence of pain, in the presence of difficult emotions, chaos, complexity. It's this idea that regardless of what's happening outside of us, we can remain calm and centered inside of us. So again, it is not pretending that someone's behaviors are not harmful. It's not looking past things that we should absolutely not look past. It's not forcing yourself to feel warm, affectionate, loving in a way that doesn't feel honest to you. It's the ability to hold the truth of what happened, all the emotions that come along with it, and the humanity of the person who caused the harm without being consumed by it. And this may be the highest branch for certain people in our lives. We may never get to what we would call love, that warm, fuzzy, lovely feeling that we often physically experience when we really love someone. We may never get to that, but I think most of us can get to equanimity. Most of us can get to that place where what that person did and how they hurt us no longer controls how we feel on the inside. And that's equanimity. And we can choose peace without denying the pain. And that's what equanimity allows us to do. You can be honest about how someone hurt you and all the feelings that went with it, and still choose peace. Choose to release what you're holding. Choose to love yourself, the current you, and your inner child. You can choose to not see the other person as a monster or as inhuman. And that is enough often for us to get to peace, to get to equanimity, because equanimity is where peace exists. It's knowing that all you need is inside of you and it's always available to you. And you should allow yourself to feel your emotions without getting completely consumed by them. So I hope this was helpful. If you are dealing with a difficult person in your life. Personally, this week I had written these posts that were about this topic on my newsletter, and then decided it was important enough that I would record these podcast episodes as well. And in the interim between writing the posts and creating these podcast episodes, I had a situation. I have an ongoing difficult relationship with someone very close to me in my life. And we tend to have flares. So things will be fine for a while, and then something will happen and it will flare up again. And we've been in and out of this cycle for years now, for many years now. And throughout that time, I have very much evolved and changed in what I think about it, how I feel, what I feel my part is, what I feel the other person's part is, what I am willing to tolerate and what I'm not, what boundaries need to be set. And this last flare that just occurred really made it clear to me what boundary absolutely had to be set unequivocally and how much grief I was carrying that I didn't realize that I was carrying. I knew I was angry. I knew that I was frustrated. I knew that I was resentful. Years ago, I felt guilty, but I did release that guilt a long time ago. But it was the grief. It was the grief that I didn't realize that I was holding that has made a huge difference in how I'm approaching this situation now. And it was also the wound because and this is where that svadhyaya comes in, where we that self-study, where we keep coming back and reflecting on what is my part here. So in my particular situation in the relationship that is really challenging me right now, I have really reflected and I believe that this other person is completely in the wrong. However, the fact that they were able to ignite such a level of anger and rage and frustration inside of me, and that it stayed with me for days on end after the inciting incident, told me that there is a wound there that I am carrying. We talked in the previous episode about how our ego tries to protect us from our wounds just by covering them over, not by healing them. And what happens is when something upsets us to a degree where we can't release it, where we spend days, weeks, months holding on to it, rehearsing the conversation in our heads, thinking about what we should have said or what we will say, feeling that sense of just discomfort inside our bodies because we're holding the anger, we're holding the energy of the anger or the fear, whatever emotions are present for us. When we can't think straight, we maybe can't sleep. There are so many physical sensations that can come along with it. When we find ourselves getting worked up to that degree and being unable to release it, and I've been trying to release it. I've taken long walks in nature, I've meditated and done yoga and prayed and journaled. And yes, those things have all been helpful. And I highly recommend them if you're going through something really difficult with someone else. However, it hasn't fully released, and I can feel that it's still in my body. And I know it's because it's a wound that has been touched, it's been poked at, it's been more than poked at, right? It wasn't a mild touch, it was an aggressive attack of a wound that I carry. And it is not the other person's responsibility to heal that wound for me. It's my responsibility. It's my responsibility to recognize the wound and to work on healing it so that I don't get sent into such a tailspin again. It doesn't mean that the other person's behavior was uh, okay or correct. It doesn't mean that a boundary doesn't need to be set. It doesn't mean that I don't need to speak my truth, right? All of these things still need to happen. But if I don't study myself and understand the wound that is present that is causing me to go so far off of my center, then someone or something else will just pick at that wound again. And I'll find myself in the exact same spot, right? Maybe it's the same person, maybe it's a different person, but it will come back. And so we each have a responsibility, no matter how wrong the other person was, or how awful what the other person did to you was. We're not negating their responsibility, but we also have to see our own responsibility. And my responsibility is to set a clear boundary, be honest with myself, discern what needs to be said and what doesn't need to be said and what boundary needs to be set, and then look at the wound underneath and begin to heal it. I know this is a big topic. I know it may have brought up a lot of emotions. I can tell you that in different phases of my journey and my healing and evolution, some of the things that I said here today would have likely triggered me. So, if that is you, I first invite you to look at why maybe it triggered you, but also get in contact with me. Email me. You can message me on Substack. You can message me on Instagram too. I'm not over there all that often, but I do pop over there once or twice a week. I really invite you, if you want to have a further conversation about this, that I'm here for it. I think this is one of the most important things that we can learn to practice. And this is a practice, it's another spiritual practice. And it's one of the most important things that we can learn to practice in our lives, because the anger, the hurt, the resentment, the grief, that internal disruption, that doesn't stay within us. It, first of all, you don't want it in you because it's a miserable feeling to have, and it's also can actually make you sick, but it doesn't stay within you. It comes out in your words, your actions, your ability to love and be loved, your ability to be present. It really infects every area of your life, your children, your partnerships, friendships, your work. And so it is our responsibility to dive into this work, to not try to sweep it under the rug or just blame the other person and move on, to see where we're being triggered, why we're being triggered, what needs to be healed, and what action we need to take to help us get to that place. And that action can include things like protecting yourself, right? So sometimes the action is, I can't have this person in my life. I have to release this relationship because they're unwilling to change. And as we've talked about, you can't make someone change. And in order to heal, to give myself the space to heal, maybe the boundary is we don't have a relationship. And that can be really hard. And I've had to do that in my life, just with one person, but it was a family member and it was very difficult. But there was no way that I could have healed with them in my life. And there was no way I could have returned to equanimity. And they had no interest in they had no interest in changing or evolving. And so that's what had to be done. So discernment, discernment, discernment. Get quiet, reflect, journal, see your part, see their part, and see what needs to be done. But always from that place of love, always from that place of peace, love for yourself, love for the soul that the other person is, and love for your life and how you don't want this to become an infection in your life. All right, friends, love to hear from you. Head on over to Substack, sign up for my newsletter for more reflections, more spiritual teachings, always using ancient wisdom as a guide on our journey as we walk ourselves home to each other and to ourselves. Have a great week.